There are few characters in The Lord of the Rings who are more crucial to the plot than Aragorn. He's a guide to the hobbits, a champion to the Rohirrim, and a king to the men of Gondor. In fact, of the 6 books that make up The Lord of the Rings, more of them feature Aragorn than either Frodo or the Ring. In his first appearance at the Prancing Pony, he is simply Strider of the Wilderness. But only 7 months later, he is crowned King Elessar of the Dunedain. So, how does a ranger from the north become king in the south? And what exactly was Aragorn doing in the 87 years leading up to it? Alla Tulia Meldonia Aharamariese, my name is Rainbow Dave, and welcome to another Tolkien lore video. So in order to fully understand how a ranger can become a king, we first need to go all the way back to the moment of Aragorn's birth. Because just like his father and grandfather before him, Aragorn was actually born into royalty. His ancestors were kings. His name literally means the revered king. And yet, Aragorn was born with no lands to rule. He was an heir of Isildur, but he had no kingdom to inherit. All he had was his name. You see, back in the early Third Age, the proud kingdom of Arinor, that's the kingdom of Elendil and Isildur, fell to the power of the Witch King. Almost 1,000 years before Aragorn was even born, the kings of both Arinor and Gondor were wiped out. And all that remained of Isildur's descendants were the humble chieftains of the Dunedain, the chieftains of the Rangers of the North. And at the time of Aragorn's birth, these Rangers had fallen on hard times. So, just as Aragorn is an heir of Isildur, so too was his father Arathorn, and his grandfather Arador. But, unfortunately, being an heir of Isildur comes with its fair share of dangers. You see, although the strength of the Dunedain had significantly waned since the days of Isildur, the very fact that they still existed made them a threat to Sauron, and Sauron knew it. He feared the heirs of the man who cut the ring from his finger, and so as long as the Dark Lord endured, the heirs of Isildur were not safe. The year before Aragorn was born, his grandfather Arador was captured and killed by trolls of the Cold Fells. And only 3 years later, Aragorn's father, Arathorn, was slain by an orc arrow through the eye. So, when Aragorn was only 2 years old, he became the last surviving heir of Isildur. 85 years before The Lord of the Rings, the future of the Dunedain rested upon the fate of a baby. A baby who was destined to be king. Now, over the course of Aragorn's story, we'll see that there are a number of notable symmetries between Aragorn and 2 of his exceedingly distant ancestors from the First Age. They are Beren and Tuor. You see, all 3 of these guys were mighty rulers of men, who'd had their realms conquered by the enemy before they were full grown. All 3 of them lost their fathers at a young age, and crucially, all 3 of them went on to take an exceptional elf as their bride. Now, it's hardly like an essential detail, but I will point out that Aragorn and his ancestor Tuor both lost their respective fathers to a poisoned orc arrow through the eye within just a year or so of being born. Now, I'm not really sure if this is like a really thought-provoking parallel or just a strangely specific coincidence, but either way, it is kind of interesting. Anyway, the real question here revolves around why Aragorn grows up to be a king of the Dúnedain when all the previous heirs of Isildur were simply chieftains. What did Aragorn have that his ancestors didn't? So, it obviously goes without saying that Aragorn did indeed survive his childhood, but he didn't do so as a Ranger of the North. You see, Aragorn's mother was a woman called Gilraen, and when Arathorn died, Gilraen brought her son, in secret, to the elven refuge of Rivendell. And there, Aragorn first met Lord Elrond. Now, if you're primarily familiar with the Lord of the Rings movies, then you may be of the understanding that Elrond and Aragorn have a bit of an uneasy relationship. But in Tolkien's writings, this could not be further from the truth. Tolkien tells us Elrond took the place of his father and came to love him as a son. He raised Aragorn in Rivendell as one of his own. And although Aragorn was too young to retain any memory of Arathorn or his life amongst the Rangers, in the House of Elrond, Aragorn grew up to be elven wise. And this is certainly a big deal in explaining Aragorn's rise from Ranger to King, but it's not something that's unique to Aragorn. It was, in fact, a tradition amongst the Dúnedain for the heirs of Isildur to be fostered by the elves in Rivendell. And both Arathorn and Arador also spent their childhoods with Lord Elrond. But in Aragorn's case, there was something different. You see, it was decided by the wise that Aragorn's name and his lineage should be kept a secret until he came of age. Not only would this protect the last heir of Isildur from the dangers of the outside world, but it also prevented Sauron from ever learning of his existence. And so, throughout all of Aragorn's formative years, he was known simply as Estel, which means trust and hope in the Elven language. And to be honest, Tolkien doesn't really tell us very much about Aragorn's boyhood, but I reckon it must have been pretty amazing. I mean, just imagine what it would be like for a mortal man to be raised entirely amongst elves. We're told that by the time Aragorn was 20, he was fair and noble and was early come to manhood. And just like his father and grandfather before him, Aragorn developed a cherished friendship with Elrond's twin sons, the elven rangers Eladan and Elrohir. In fact, in his youth, Aragorn ventured off into the wilds with these adoptive brothers. And I imagine that it was probably around this time that he developed many of the skills we'll later see during The Lord of the Rings. We know that Aragorn is a gifted ranger and an excellent tracker and an exceptional healer, and yet he didn't acquire these skills from the Dúnedain. Instead, Aragorn's abilities come from the elves. However, Aragorn's youthful days as Estel did, of course, have to come to an end. And when he turned 21 and returned to Rivendell after great deeds in the company of the sons of Elrond, it was time for Estel to learn the truth. So, in the year 2952, Lord Elrond called Aragorn by his true name for the first time, and he presented Aragorn with heirlooms from the house of Isildur. Now, of these heirlooms, there are 3 that are particularly important in explaining Aragorn's journey from Ranger to King. One of these heirlooms is the broken blade Narsil, which was of course used to cut the One Ring from Sauron's finger, and it will of course one day be reforged into Andúril. And another heirloom is the Ring of Barahir, which is the same ring that we see Aragorn wearing in the movies. Now, this ring has a bit of a crazy history, and it's very possibly the single oldest piece of jewellery in Middle-earth. It predates the Rings of Power by thousands of years, and it's even older than the sun and the moon. And unfortunately, there's nowhere near enough time for me to fully explain how this ring ended up in Isildur's possession, But way, way, way back, possibly around 10,000 years ago, the ring's original owner was actually Galadriel's older brother. And he gave this ring to a mortal man called Barahir. And as it goes, Barahir was the father of Aragorn's First Age ancestor, Beren. So this Ring of Barahir is a big deal, and it's a hugely significant part of Aragorn's family history. Now, the last heirloom of Isildur's that Elrond had in his possession was a silver rod called the Scepter of Annúminas. And this Scepter of Annúminas was also ancient, and it originally belonged to Elendil, the first High King of the Dúnedain. The scepter was both an artifact of Númenor and a symbol of the ancient kings of men. But unlike the Shards of Narsil and the Ring of Barahir, Elrond did not give the Scepter of Annúminas to Aragorn, for Aragorn was not yet a king. Instead, Elrond told his adopted son that the scepter I withhold, for you have yet to earn it. But he also told Aragorn that the span of your life shall be greater than the measure of men, unless evil befalls you or you fail at the test. Now, this test is very important. In fact, I would argue that it is critical in understanding Aragorn's journey from Ranger to King. And it's also critical in unravelling the character of Aragorn in the books from Aragorn in the movies. So, I feel like most people will agree that Viggo Mortensen did a fantastic job at portraying Aragorn in Peter Jackson's films. I personally don't have a single bad thing to say about him. But the way that the character is written in the movies is very, very different from how he's written in the books. You know, in the movies he's afflicted with doubt about his destiny, but Tolkien actually tells us that after learning the truth of his heritage, Aragorn's heart was high within him, for he was full of hope. It seems that Aragorn agreed with his adoptive father's assertion that the kingship had to be earned. And I believe that this desire to earn his destiny and to prove himself worthy of Isildur and his heirs is a critical part of what motivates Aragorn throughout the next 6 decades of his life. However, before I get too far ahead of myself, there is one more character that needs to be introduced to this story. Because although Elrond and Elladan and Elrohir are all crucial players in Aragorn's youth, there's one more member of their family who's remained conspicuously absent up until this point. You see, literally the very next day after learning the truth about his lineage, Aragorn went out into the woods for a solitary walk. And whilst he was out, he began singing a song called The Lay of Luthien, which tells the story of how that distant ancestor Beren first encountered the angelic elf maiden Luthien, aka his future wife. Now, there's definitely more than one example of symmetry between Aragorn and Beren, but right here we see what is perhaps the most striking one. Because we're told that while Aragorn was singing this song about Beren and Luthien, Luthien walked before his eyes in Rivendell. And I feel like this must have been an incredibly surreal moment for Aragorn. Partly because Luthien was his grandmother 67 times removed, and also partly because she'd been dead for nearly 6,500 years by this point. Also, she lived like thousands of miles away in a part of the world that doesn't even exist anymore. So, you probably don't need me to tell you that it turns out Aragorn was mistaken. The woman who stood before him, clad in a mantle of silver and blue, fair as the twilight, was not, in fact, the ghost of Luthien, but instead it was her great-great-granddaughter, Arwen Undomiel. Now, we all know that Arwen's father was Aragorn's adoptive father, and we all know that Arwen's brothers were Aragorn's adoptive brothers. But, thankfully, Arwen and Aragorn never had any sort of brother-sister relationship. And this is because, throughout Aragorn's first 21 years of life, Arwen had been entirely absent from Rivendell. Instead of living with her father and brothers, she'd been living far away in Lothlorien, with her grandparents Galadriel and Celeborn. And so, only one day after learning the truth about his heritage, Aragorn met Arwen for the very first time. And Tolkien tells us that in this moment, Aragorn believed he'd strayed into a dream. Now, apparently Aragorn isn't particularly great at hiding his emotions, because in the days that followed, both his mother Gilaraen and Lord Elrond perceived that some strange thing had come over him. And although I don't believe that Elrond was exactly thrilled about his adoptive son falling in love with his only daughter, he wasn't quite as grumpy about it as he is in the movies. We're told that Elrond said to Aragorn, "The years will bring what they will. We will speak no more of this until many have passed." And it appears that Aragorn agreed to his adoptive father's terms, because the very next day after that conversation, he took leave lovingly of Elrond and disappeared into the wild for nearly 30 years. And I guess these years mark a really significant turning point in Aragorn's life. Because up until this departure, he had lived his whole life as Estelle. But in the space of only a few days, Aragorn had learned the truth about his ancestry, he'd inherited 2 out of 3 heirlooms of Isildur's, and he had come face to face with the woman he'd one day marry. And so, I believe it's during these years in the wilderness that Estelle of Rivendell truly grows into Aragorn of the Dunedain. And Tolkien actually gives us some really cool details about what Aragorn was getting up to during these long years in the wild. So, for the first 4 years of his travels, it seems that Aragorn stayed in the north, and he explored the lands of his ancestors and his kin. And it's during these years of wandering the north that Aragorn first encountered his future friend, Gandalf the Grey. And it was actually upon the wizard's advice that Aragorn first began to take an interest in the secretive northern realm known as the Shire. Over the course of his travels, the men of the north came to know Aragorn by reputation, but he kept his true identity a secret from all save his fellow rangers. And so, as the years went on, Aragorn became known in the north as Strider. And this is of course a name that he will carry with him for the rest of his life. In fact, when Aragorn eventually does become King Elessar, he adopts the name Telcontar as the name of his royal house, and it's like his family name. And what Telcontar literally means is simply Strider, in the Quenya language of the High Elves. Anyway, while Aragorn lingered in the north, all was not well in the south. Only a few years after he left Rivendell, Mount Doom burst into flame. And in the very same year that Aragorn learned of his lineage, Sauron declared himself openly, and began the rebuilding of Barad-dûr. So, at the age of just 26, Aragorn undertook his first great journey into the south. And for the first time in his life, he passed into the lands of Rohan and Gondor. And for the next 23 years, Aragorn aided the free peoples of the West in their renewed war against Sauron. In fact, it was during this time that Aragorn first encountered a few familiar faces from The Lord of the Rings, including a 9-year-old Theoden and a 27-year-old Denethor. But, just as he did while living in the north, Aragorn kept his heritage and his true name a secret. And so, to the men of Rohan and Gondor, Aragorn became known as Thorongil, which means the Eagle of the Star, for he was swift and keen-eyed and wore a silver star upon his cloak. Now, to be honest, Tolkien doesn't really tell us very much about Thorongil's exploits in Rohan, except that for some time he rode alongside Theoden's father, King Thengel, but he does give us some very cool details about what Thorongil got up to in Gondor. You see, Denethor's father, and Boromir and Faramir's grandfather, was the steward Ecthelion. And we're told that Ecthelion was a man of wisdom who began to strengthen his realm against the assault of Mordor. And so, Ecthelion encouraged all men of worth to come to Minas Tirith and to enter his service. And of course, the captain that Ecthelion loved above all was Thorongil. Now, Thorongil certainly did make a name for himself in Minas Tirith, and his greatest achievement came during his campaign against Gondor's ancestral enemies, the Corsairs of Umbar. Tolkien tells us that with Ecthelion's leave, Thorongil gathered a small fleet and sailed into Umbar under the cover of night. There, he burned a great part of the ships of the Corsairs, and he even killed their captain in single combat upon the quays. However, when the time came for the victorious fleet of Gondorians to return to Minas Tirith and to receive the favour of Ecthelion, Thorongil departed, and he journeyed alone towards the mountains of Mordor. And as it turns out, Aragorn would not set foot in Minas Tirith again until he came to the Houses of Healing after the Battle of Pelennor Fields. You see, although pretty much everyone in Gondor absolutely loved Thorongil, there was one person who didn't. And that person was Ecthelion's son and his heir, Denethor. Now, we are told that Denethor was subtle in mind, and looked further and deeper than other men of his day. And it's implied that Denethor was the only one who discovered the truth about Thorongil's identity. And it seems Denethor feared that Thorongil would one day supplant him as the future ruler of Gondor, which technically he wasn't wrong to worry about. But anyway, just before I move on, there's one more potentially really lovely detail here, because 2 years before Aragorn's battle with the Corsairs, Denethor's wife gave birth to their first son. And this son is of course Boromir. So, it's very possible that perhaps Aragorn and Boromir may have met right at the beginning of Boromir's life. Perhaps Aragorn even held him as a baby. Now, it's incredibly unlikely that Boromir would ever have known about this, but if we skip forward just under 40 years to the end of Boromir's life, then we'll find that Aragorn is there once again, holding Boromir in his arms as he dies. It's another really beautiful moment of potential symmetry. Anyway, after leaving Gondor and Rohan, Aragorn's life once again becomes a bit of a mystery. Tolkien tells us that he ventured southeast, and he even journeyed into the lands around Mordor. We know that he explored the hearts of men, good and evil, and he discovered many of the plots and devices that were contrived by the servants of Sauron. However, beyond that, Aragorn's odyssey through the lands of the enemy remains a mystery. But eventually, Aragorn's days of wandering the wilds did come to an end. And at the ripe old age of 49, Aragorn returned from the lands of shadow to seek rest and recuperation once again amongst the elves. However, this time it wasn't Elrond or his sons in Rivendell that Aragorn sought shelter with, but instead he came to the hidden realm of Lothlorien, where he first encountered the Lady Galadriel and her husband Celeborn. Now, I guess it's fair to say that when Aragorn first arrived in Lothlorien, he probably wasn't looking his best. I mean, he'd just spent a good deal of time wandering around the dark confines of Mordor, so I imagine he wasn't really, dressed to impress. But good old Galadriel, she perceived that Aragorn was now grown to full stature of body and mind. And so she gave him what I can really only describe as a makeover. We're told that Galadriel clothed him in silver and white, with a cloak of elven grey and a bright gem upon his brow. And this restyling is important because what happens next is the final catalyst in Aragorn's journey from Ranger to King. You see, what Aragorn did not know was that in the nearly 30 years since he had left Rivendell, Arwen had also travelled back to Lothlorien, and she just so happened to be there at the same time as Aragorn. And this is where we see a lovely little reversal of Aragorn and Arwen's first encounter all those years ago. Because it's while Arwen is out walking beneath the golden trees of her grandparents' realm that she and Aragorn are once again reunited. And because Aragorn is dressed in the fine raiment that Galadriel gave him, Arwen at first mistakes him for an elf lord from the Isles of the West. And so, it's in this moment that Arwen makes the all-important choice that will decide not only her fate, but also the fate of the Dunedain. You see, for one whole season, Aragorn and Arwen wandered together in the glades of Lothlorien. And on Midsummer's Eve, Aragorn removed the ring of Barahir from his finger, and he presented it to Arwen as a symbol of their betrothal. Now, when Elrond learned of his daughter's engagement, I think it's fair to say that he was somewhat conflicted, but he certainly didn't blame Aragorn for Arwen's choice. And 30 years after their original conversation about Aragorn's love for his daughter, Elrond said to his adopted son, "Though I love you, I say to you, Arwen Undormiel shall not diminish her life's grace for any man less than the king of both Gondor and Arnor." And so, with that sentence, Elrond set in motion the return of the king. To earn the love of Arwen Undormiel, Aragorn went forth again to danger and toil, and the next time he crops up in the story is just after the 111st birthday party of Bilbo Baggins. Now, Aragorn does go on one more epic adventure to hunt down Gollum before showing up in the Prancing Pony, and I've already made a video about that, I'll put a link to it below, but this pretty much catches us up with the Strider that we're all familiar with from the Fellowship of the Ring. So, let's think back for a moment to those 3 heirlooms of Isildur's. By the time of the Lord of the Rings, the Ring of Barahir belonged to Arwen. The Scepter of Anúminas was kept by Elrond, and the reforged shards of Narsil were borne by Aragorn. Over the next 3 months, Aragorn undertook his second great journey from Rivendell to Gondor. And although he definitely took his sweet time in getting there, When Aragorn finally did arrive at Minas Tirith, aboard the black ships of the Corsairs, he brought hope to the fields of Pelennor. Now, I know in the movies Aragorn just kind of shows up with the army of the dead, but in Tolkien's writings, the Oathbreakers had already served their purpose by then. Instead, Aragorn arrived at the battle with the twin sons of Elrond, a company of rangers from the north, and an army of reinforcements from the outlands of Gondor. Just as all hope seemed lost for the men of the west, Aragorn unfurled the black and silver standard of Elendil and Isildur, a standard that had been stitched for him by Arwen, and he led his people to victory. He brought the sword that was broken to the City of Kings, and he revealed to Sauron that Isildur's heir had finally returned. And only 10 days later, Sauron was destroyed with his ring. Only 45 days later, Aragorn was crowned king. And only 3 months later, Arwen and Elrond arrived in Minas Tirith, where they beheld King Elessar for the very first time. The 3 heirlooms of Isildur's house were finally reunited. So, on Midsummer's Eve, 39 years to the day since his daughter's betrothal in Lothlorien, Elrond finally presented the scepter of Enumenas to his adopted son. And the very next day, Arwen married the High King of the Dunedain. So, if we look back now to our original questions, how does a ranger become a king? I guess what the answer ultimately boils down to is love. What did Aragorn have that the other heirs of Isildur didn't? Well, in terms of heritage and birthright and upbringing, they were really all pretty much the same. But Aragorn had the love of Arwen. Aragorn earned her hand in marriage, and so for the sake of spending his life with the elf maiden he loved, Aragorn united the ancient kingdoms of the Dunedain, and he fulfilled his destiny as Isildur's heir. For 122 years, Aragorn ruled alongside his queen, and together they founded a new dynasty for the Dunedain that lasted long into the Fourth Age. And when his time finally did come, Aragorn walked the silent street of Minas Tirith. He lay down in his bed, and with his family at his side, he allowed himself to die. Arwen endured only one single winter of grief without her husband, and in that time she journeyed alone into the east, until she came back to the now empty lands of Lothlorien. And there, she too laid herself to rest, and she joined her husband in death. Throughout the Legendarium, there are loads of kings. Some are great, some are terrible, some are in between. But I would argue that there's no other king in Middle-earth's history who truly earns his right to rule in the same way that Aragorn does. He was born into a ragged house long bereft of lordship, but in the years between meeting Arwen and eventually marrying her, Aragorn redeemed the house of Isildur. He united the men of the West, and he ruled as the third High King of all Dunedain. So, thank you all very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, there are plenty more like it on the channel, but I'm afraid this is going to be the last big video that I put out for at least a little while. And the reason for that is that I'm currently in the process of moving cities, and I've got to start a new job, and I'm also looking at starting to write a book that is threatening to take up a lot of my time. But I promise you that Tolkien Untangled will return after a brief hiatus. And when it does, I know a few of you have been asking, I give you my word that I will continue with the Silmarillion series. I'll make more videos explaining that, and I'll also continue with the videos explaining the differences between the Lord of the Rings books and the movies. So stay tuned for more videos coming soon. But until then, my dear friends, as always, much love. Stay groovy, and Navaya Melanine.